Welcome to Yellowstone Story. Every story holds a lesson, a twist, or a spark of inspiration. Here, we dive into gripping tales, some heartwarming, some shocking, but all unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let's begin. I always knew I didn't fit into their world, but to hear it so directly, it felt like I should have gotten used to their cold attitude, but each time it still hurt. Andrew's mother, Victoria, didn't try to hide her contempt. She spoke about me as if I weren't even a person, but just a problem that needed to be solved. In her eyes, I was unworthy of attention, a girl from a different circle, not worthy of their family. Victoria would disdainfully point out that I didn't understand table manners, not knowing that my hands were used to working with more than just forks and knives, but also with a needle, creating outfits worn by women far wealthier than her. But I had already made my decision. I was going. In the past few days, I had barely seen Andrew, not because I was avoiding him, but because I had too much to do. After work, I rushed to my client, Catherine, the owner of a chain of boutiques. She was a woman who had built everything herself. In her life, nothing happened by chance, only hard work, ambition, and determination. She had once been an outsider in the city, arriving with nothing but a desire to succeed. Early failures hardened her. She learned to be tough, to cast aside unnecessary emotions, but eventually, she realized her world had become empty. She had money, but no joy. That was when she started helping those who, like her once, were searching for their place. When she looked at me, it was as if she saw a younger version of herself. Maybe that's why she decided to support me. "Emily, sit down. Everything is ready," she exclaimed. "Chris, my assistant, will be bringing the dress soon." I smiled, glancing at the perfectly set table. There were too many forks, knives, and spoons, and it seemed impossible to figure them all out. "I don't know if I'll ever learn all this," I admitted. Catherine smirked. "It's easier than it looks. And you're a smart girl, you'll manage." The day was approaching. Victoria was certain that this evening would put everything in its place. Andrew waited anxiously, knowing that no words could change what was about to happen, and I was preparing, not just for dinner, but for battle. An hour later, I was confidently handling the utensils, feeling my hesitation gradually fade. At that moment, Chris, Catherine's assistant, arrived. He immediately understood what was going on and gave me a knowing smirk. When he learned that Andrew had offered me money to feel more comfortable, he simply nodded, as if it all made perfect sense. Catherine didn't let him dwell on the topic, but he stayed, observing as I tried on different outfits. He took notes, analyzed details, and didn't hide his admiration. The atmosphere was light, even fun, and for the first time in a long while, I felt supported. Once all the preparations were finished, Catherine summed it up. Tomorrow, Victoria was in for a real shock. She and Chris would be there too, which gave me an extra boost of confidence. Meanwhile, Andrew stood at the entrance of the restaurant, anxiously scanning each arriving guest. He knew that this evening could change everything. Victoria accepted congratulations with a pleasant smile, chatting with guests while casually mentioning that her son was getting married. There was a hint of amusement in her tone, as if it were nothing more than one of Andrew's fleeting whims. She was certain I wouldn't show up. If I had even the slightest sense of propriety, I simply wouldn't be able to endure this evening. The guests had already gathered when Victoria turned to her son, asking where his fiancée was. Andrew shrugged, replying that he hadn't been able to reach me. There was a trace of hope in his voice, as if he truly believed I had changed my mind at the last moment. But then, the doors opened, and silence filled the room. I stepped into the restaurant, and every gaze immediately turned toward me. Andrew's expression froze. Victoria stood motionless. The head of the family smirked, poured himself a glass of cognac, and took a sip, clearly enjoying the moment. Andrew moved toward me, his face a mix of shock and admiration. This was not what he had expected. He couldn't have imagined me in this setting. in this way. The thought of meeting me outside had completely vanished from his mind the moment he saw how I entered, poised, composed, without a trace of hesitation. Andrew didn't know why he had imagined me in a modest floral dress, one I had never owned. Maybe, in his mind, it was a symbol of how his mother saw me, simple, provincial, unfit for their world. But he was wrong. I handed Victoria my gift. It had cost me all my savings, but Catherine had helped me choose it, knowing that for me, this gesture was more than just a formality. She worried that I was sacrificing too much, but I only smiled. It was just another reason to work harder, to save again. Would that change after marriage? Hardly. Looking at this family, I was more convinced than ever that I wasn't just marrying Andrew, I was marrying his mother as well. Catherine had laughed when I mentioned it, acknowledging that there was some truth to my words. In their house, men earned the money, but Victoria always had the final say. She observed me closely, her cold analysis undisguised. In her eyes, I was an outsider, someone who had ended up here by accident. After the congratulations, everyone took their seats. With a polite smile, Victoria casually suggested difficult, unfamiliar dishes, expecting me to make a mistake, to reveal my ignorance. But I handled it all flawlessly, leaving her no reason to mock me. This evening was her test for me, and I had no intention of failing. A little later, as I stood next to Andrew, I caught fragments of a conversation nearby. Someone sounded confused. They had been promised a spectacle, a reason to laugh, but nothing amusing was happening. Another voice responded, reminding them that Victoria had already introduced me to everyone as someone outside their circle, almost like a random passerby who had somehow stumbled into their family. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and walked toward the exit. Andrew caught up with me outside, his voice filled with concern. I didn't wait for excuses. He had known exactly why his mother had orchestrated this evening, yet he had done nothing to stop it. For him, it was enough that things hadn't ended in humiliation. But for me, it wasn't. When I asked why he had stayed silent while people spoke about me with such contempt, he only frowned, as if he didn't understand what I wanted from him. Did I really expect him to start a fight? These were respected, important people after all. I didn't care. Their opinions, their status, their wealth. None of it mattered to me. The only thing I knew for certain was that I never wanted to find myself in a situation like this again, where I was treated not as a person, but as a mistake. But for Andrew, it wasn't that simple. He looked at me, not fully understanding what I meant when I said I no longer wanted to be part of this world. In his reality, you couldn't just walk away. I met his gaze, and in that moment, everything became clear. I could have married him, but not his mother. Victoria wasn't just a part of his life, she controlled it. And I knew that, to her, I would always be an outsider. Find someone who fits your mother's standards, I said calmly, and walked away without looking back. Andrew didn't stop me. He simply stood there, watching as I left. I had no idea what he was feeling at that moment, but I no longer cared. As I turned the corner, a car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a familiar voice called out, light and teasing, with a hint of amusement. Andrew's father, Richard, didn't interfere. He preferred to step back, as if it had nothing to do with him. Maybe he didn't care, or maybe he just didn't want to argue with his wife. I didn't blame him. In such families, the main thing is to maintain order, not to go against established rules. Andrew always defended me in front of his mother, but her opinion remained unchanged. In her eyes, I was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their world. She refused to believe that there could be real love between us. She's just an aspiring designer, Victoria would say with contempt, and you're the heir to the family business. What could you possibly have in common? She said to Andrew. I can't let such a beautiful woman wander the city alone. Hop in. I'll treat you to coffee and the best croissants in town, Chris said. I laughed at the unexpected but amusing remark. The best? I asked, raising an eyebrow. The very best. Or at least, that's what the people who make them claim, he replied with a grin. I got into the car, feeling the tension of the evening slowly fade away. Chris smiled, unsurprised by my decision. I had a feeling this would happen. You're not the kind of person who puts up with things like that, he said confidently. I reached up and removed the necklace, one that had symbolized my attempt to fit into a world that was never meant for me. A sudden wave of relief washed over me. Victoria had believed this evening would humiliate me, but instead, it had only helped me see the truth. Everything had fallen into place. From that moment on, Chris and I were never apart. She didn't understand that I wasn't after her wealth, that I wasn't looking for personal gain. I simply loved her son. But Victoria saw only ambition in me, the desire to escape my poor life by using Andrew. I knew he was exhausted by her constant attacks, but I also knew that changing her perspective on me was impossible. In her world, people didn't step outside the boundaries of their social status, and Andrew choosing me disrupted her order. Andrew always knew how to calm me down. He assured me that his mother's opinion didn't matter, that we would get through this despite her disapproval. But I could see that it troubled him. He had learned to agree with his mother to avoid conflicts, only to do things his own way later. But this time was different. We had submitted our marriage application, and there was no turning back. Victoria made no effort to hide her displeasure, turning our meeting into an interrogation. I could see Andrew struggling with himself. He wanted peace in his family, but he knew it was impossible. I didn't fit into their world, and his mother wasn't going to hide that fact. You knew this would happen, I told him when we were alone. Maybe you should really consider someone closer to your world? He looked at me in shock, as if he couldn't believe I would say such a thing. But before he could respond, his phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen. Emily, good afternoon. Am I interrupting? She asked. Her voice was so unusually friendly that I almost dropped my phone. I was just finishing work on a dress for one of my clients when my phone rang. The moment I heard Victoria's voice, I tensed. She sounded friendly, too friendly. She informed me that she was inviting me to her birthday celebration and mentioned the most expensive restaurant in the city. At that moment, everything became clear. This wasn't an act of goodwill, it was a test. Victoria wanted to put me in an uncomfortable position, to make me look out of place so that Andrew would turn away from me on his own. I couldn't hold back. The emotions overwhelmed me, and tears welled up in my eyes. I set my phone down, struggling to compose myself. My client noticed my distress, but I wasn't used to complaining, especially to someone I barely knew. Yet, at that moment, I just needed to speak. I told her everything, how Andrew's mother refused to accept me, how she saw me as nothing more than a gold digger, and how she had now decided to test how much of a disgrace I could be in front of her guests. My client listened intently before letting out a small smirk, as if none of this surprised her in the least. She assured me that Victoria had always been this way. When it came to money and reputation, she became a completely different person. But instead of pity, I heard confidence in her voice. We'll figure something out, she said, with more determination than I felt within myself. I had no idea what I could do. Victoria would never accept me, no matter how hard I tried, and that would never change. But my client seemed certain otherwise. In her mind, Victoria was expecting me to fail, to embarrass myself in front of her guests. But what if the opposite happened? What if I didn't just endure this test but made them see me differently? I didn't know how to do it yet, but the idea planted itself in my mind. Meanwhile, Andrew was just as puzzled. His mother, who was always careful with money and avoided lavish events, had suddenly decided to throw an extravagant celebration. It was suspicious. Victoria made no effort to hide her true intentions. She wasn't introducing me as his future wife, but as a mistake he would eventually recognize himself. Andrew refused to play along. He made it clear that he wouldn't allow his mother to humiliate me. If I didn't go, he wouldn't either. but Victoria only smirked. She wasn't forbidding us to be together. She was simply urging him to look at the situation rationally. Her voice was cold and calculated. For her, this dinner was meant to be proof that I didn't belong in their world. Andrew tried to convince himself that his mother's words didn't matter, but doubt had already crept in. In a way, she was right. Love could make people blind. But I wasn't just a fleeting infatuation. I knew he wanted to protect me, but I also knew he was afraid this evening wouldn't go the way he hoped. He offered me money, not to buy my appearance, but to help me feel more confident in his family's environment. I refused. I didn't need to look different to prove my worth. If he truly loved me, he needed to accept me as I was, not try to fit me into his mother's standards. I saw the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't just worried for me, he was worried for himself, afraid that I wouldn't make it through the evening, that it would all end in disaster.